It was a cold, moonless night. I was driving along a deserted rural road, surrounded by dense, dark trees. The only sound was the rumble of the car's engine and the occasional rustling of the leaves as the wind blew. It was already past midnight, and I still had a few more hours of driving ahead of me. That's when I saw him. At the side of the road, a man was standing, waving desperately. He was dressed in worn, dark clothes, and his silhouette stood out against the faint glow of my car's headlights. For a moment, I thought about driving on, but something about his expression, or perhaps the urgency with which he waved, made me stop. When I pulled the car over next to him, I rolled down the window and asked if he needed help. The man approached the car with slow steps. His eyes were glazed over, fixed on some distant point, and his face had a vacant, lifeless expression. He said he needed a ride to the next town because his car had broken down. Something in his voice made me feel uneasy, but there was no one else around, and I didn't want to leave him there alone. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let him in. As soon as he settled into the passenger seat, a shiver ran down my spine. The air inside the car seemed to get colder, as if a chilling presence had crept in. I tried to make small talk to break the uncomfortable silence, asking about his car and how he ended up there. He replied in a monotone, as if he were reciting a rehearsed story. The car stopped suddenly and I got stuck. The way he spoke, almost devoid of emotion, made my discomfort turn into fear. After that, he remained silent, staring straight ahead without blinking. I could see his reflection in the rearview mirror, and it was as if he wasn't even breathing. My hands were sweaty on the steering wheel, and I started to get the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept driving, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if I would never reach my destination. Then the car began to fail. The engine sputtered a few times, and the dashboard lights flickered, as if something was draining the vehicle's energy. With each failure, my heart beat faster. I tried to stay calm, and when I looked over at the passenger seat to ask the man to check what was in the bag he was carrying, I froze. The seat was empty. He had vanished. The car door was still locked from the inside, and I hadn't heard any sound of it opening. A chill ran through my entire body, and fear settled deep in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see something, anything, but all I saw was the dark, deserted road stretching behind me. I floored the accelerator, trying to get away from there as fast as possible. The engine seemed to be running normally again, but my heart was still racing. When I finally reached the next town, I parked the car and got out, still trembling. I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just too tired imagining things, but the dent in the passenger seat, as if someone had indeed been sitting there, told me otherwise. I shared the story with a few people in town, and that's when an older man approached and spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first. Many years ago, a man died on that road after his car broke down in the middle of the night. They say that sometimes he still looks for a ride, trying to find his way back home. Since then, I never stopped to give rides to strangers, especially on deserted roads. Because that night I realized that not everyone who asks for help is really human." It was a cold, early morning, and I was driving alone on a deserted highway. The stars were hidden by thick clouds, and the only light came from my car's headlights, illuminating the dark road ahead. I had decided to travel during the night to avoid traffic, but the oppressive silence around me was beginning to weigh on me. The journey was long, and I still had a few more hours to go. That's when I saw it for the first time. In the rearview mirror, I noticed the headlights of a truck approaching rapidly. It was far away at first, but within seconds, it seemed to have materialized right behind me, as if it had come out of nowhere. The truck was so close that I could see the details of the cab, the dirty metal, and the dented bumper. Accelerating to get even closer, it began to honk deafeningly, as if trying to force me off the road. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the truck didn't back off. The faster I drove, the closer it got. The honking didn't stop, reverberating through the air like a cry of despair. I tried to keep control of the car, but my nerves were taking over. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and something terrified me. Despite my high speed, the truck seemed to be moving effortlessly, as if the road had no end for it. Then, without warning, it disappeared. In the blink of an eye, the headlights vanished, and the blaring honk ceased. Everything around me suddenly fell silent, as if nothing had happened. The road was empty, and I found myself alone again, with only the sound of my car's engine breaking the silence. I tried to convince myself that it was just the effect of fatigue or a hallucination caused by the darkness, but the fear continued to throb in my chest. I kept driving, trying to forget what had just happened, when suddenly, the truck's headlights appeared in front of me. It was as if it had come out of nowhere, now on the wrong side of the road, heading straight toward me. I felt my body freeze, but purely on instinct, I jerked the steering wheel with all my strength, narrowly avoiding a collision. My car veered off the road and slid onto the shoulder, almost hitting the guardrail. My heart was pounding uncontrollably, and my hands were shaking on the wheel. When I looked back, expecting to see the truck disappearing into the distance, there was nothing. The road was completely empty, as if the truck had never existed. It was impossible to explain what I had just seen. The truck had simply vanished into thin air. I couldn't go any further. I parked the car on the shoulder, trying to calm my nerves. Then, I remembered something a trucker friend had told me years ago. He spoke of an old story about that highway, about a trucker who had died in a terrible accident. They said he lost control of his truck on a night just like this one, crashing head-on with another vehicle. The driver of the other car didn't survive either. Since then, there had been reports of a phantom truck appearing and chasing drivers in the dead of night. As I tried to process what had happened, I heard a distant sound that made my blood run cold. The honking of a truck echoing through the cold, early morning air. There was nothing in sight, but the sound seemed to be getting closer, like a sinister warning. Revving the engine again, I got back on the road and drove as fast as I could to get away. Since that night, I've never taken that highway alone again. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I swear I can still hear the sound of that ghostly honk echoing in the distance, as if the lost trucker is still out there, looking for his next victim. It was a cold, rainy night. The road was deserted, and the sound of raindrops hitting the car roof was almost hypnotic. I was driving alone on a dark highway, trying to stay alert. The fatigue was starting to weigh on me, but I needed to get home before the storm worsened. The darkness seemed to swallow the road ahead, and the headlights could only illuminate a few meters in front, making everything around me feel even more oppressive. That's when something caught my attention. In the rearview mirror, I saw for a brief moment what seemed to be a woman sitting in the back seat. My vision was blurred by the rain, but I was certain of what I had seen. She was there, with wet hair covering her face, her clothes soaked as if she had just come out of a lake. I turned to look at the back seat, but there was no one there. Fear began to settle in my chest, but I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just a shadow or a reflection caused by the lights of oncoming cars. I took a deep breath and kept driving, forcing myself to focus on the road. However, the feeling that I wasn't alone didn't go away. The air inside the car felt colder, and I began to smell something strange, something like damp earth and decaying leaves. As I tried to push away those dark thoughts, I felt a presence behind me. It was as if someone was sitting there, silently watching me. The panic began to intensify, but I didn't want to look in the rearview mirror again. Part of me knew that if I looked, I would see something that shouldn't be there. I decided to ignore it, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but my whole body was covered in chills. Then I heard it, a faint sound, almost inaudible, but I could swear it was coming from the back seat. It was the sound of breathing, irregular and ragged, as if someone was trying to catch their breath. Couldn't resist. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and this time I saw her clearly. She was there, leaning forward, as if getting closer to me. Her eyes, partially hidden by her hair, seemed to be fixed directly on mine. Her mouth was slightly open, and I felt my heart stop for a moment. I jerked the steering wheel sharply, almost losing control of the car. I veered off the road and stopped on the shoulder, my heart pounding uncontrollably. I turned to look at the back seat, but it was empty, just as before. The ragged breathing had stopped, and the only sound I could hear was the heavy rain hitting the windows. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of a tired mind. But then, as I tried to start the car again, something on the rear window caught my attention. There was a handprint, clear and wet, slowly sliding downward, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass and let it slip. A chill ran down my spine, and I didn't wait to see more. I started the car and sped off, trying to get as far away from that place as quickly as possible. The fear kept growing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me, that somehow that woman had left a part of herself in the car. Since that night, I avoid driving alone on rainy days. Whenever I hear the sound of raindrops hitting the car roof, I get an involuntary shiver, and the smell of damp earth seems to return, bringing back the terror of that night. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when all I can hear is my own breathing, I swear I can feel another presence there, in the back seat, watching me,